And the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa a few months ago launched the 2017 Africa Resource Governance Index, which measures the quality of resource governance countries that together produce 82% of the world's oil, 78% of its gas, and a significant proportion of minerals, including 72% of all copper. Now, this report presents the key findings and core messages of the 2017 Resource Governance Index. At the last annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF, Channels Business News editor Bosun Omofaye had a conversation with the head of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Vera Songwe, on the essence of that index.
Now, Dr. Songwe, speak to us about the new Resource Governance Index that's just been released.
It's an amazing feat that we now have this index to look at as we talk about how the mining sector on the continent is doing. For the last almost half a decade now, we've been talking about the impact of the commodity price slump on growth. And I think that now having a clear sense of not just the price impact, but also the governance environment within which commodity exporting countries on the continent function is an important tool to help us now sort of see how we pick up from the slump going forward. This index comes at a great time because it's looking at, I think, one of the biggest issues and topics on the continent, which is basically domestic resource mobilization and how we can get more revenue to develop the continent and meet the aspirations of its people. So my belief that getting an index that tells us whether countries are actually getting the right amount of revenues, and this is what the index focuses on, is revenues. What is the revenue stream? It's value management, revenue maximization, and the business environment in which the commodity sector functions on the continent is an important tool to help us get there.
Do you think some progress have been made in trying to de-link corruption from resource revenue on the continent?
Yes, I think as the index shows, there's countries like Ghana, which is the best performing country on the continent, that is doing well. I think what the index gives us is a sense of, because it has a range of indicators that it measures, it gives us a sense of who is doing well and in what sectors and what segments of the indicator, either value maximization or the overall business environment, contracting, the stability of contracts, which is very important in the sector. I think that what we can also do with the index is complement it with other things, and something that the Economic Commission for Africa is doing, for example, is using the index and saying what else on the value chain you can do with it. And so we have the Africa Mining Initiative that looks now at how can we provide private sector support to the big mining companies and what we can do with it. And I think that this complement of the two indices and structural reforms that come to the sector are quite important.
But what further actions do you think need to be taken to arrest this resource gap and corruption that are embedded in it?
The first thing, and I think this is the strength of the index, is transparency. I think what the index allows us to have is a very clear sense of who is doing well, where, and how. And the second thing that one needs to then do is, once you have a sense of where are the areas where you need to shed more light, and as I mentioned in this contracting, for example, in the overall business environment, then you can begin to say, how can we make it better? And first we do comparisons within the continent, of course, it's a good place to start. We have, as I said, Ghana and other countries that are doing, relatively well off. But if we look at where they are compared to countries like Norway, which is the benchmark where everybody wants to get to, then we see that there are still substantial gaps in terms of progress towards best practice about how those resources are managed, what is the transparency, how can you find contracts, can you understand how they were negotiated. So I think that we don't expect everybody to have perfection, but what we are expecting is to sort of begin to put some benchmarks about, where we want to go to. And there's going to be a lot of, and I think that this is the value added of the index, is that it gives those who want to support the sector areas where you can go and enhance, build more capacity, ensure that there is capability in the countries to meet the standards that are expected of them at the international level and of their people, most importantly.
Then you have countries like Nigeria, always in the news as far as corruption tied to its oil and gas industry is concerned.
Well, Nigeria, I think, has, and as the index shows, it's neither at the top or at the bottom, it's somewhere sitting in the middle. And I think and I think this is another good thing about the index is that even within countries, it shows differences in the different sectors, the oil sector, the gas sector. I think Nigeria gives us a very good example of how you can use the mineral sector to develop local private sector. And we see this in the oil sector. There has been a lot of sort of downward induction and backward induction of the local economy. What we don't see enough of course, is the transparency in the management of the resources. And so I think, again, the wonderful thing about the index is rather than before where we just said, you know, one country is totally good or one country is totally bad, it allows us to nuance, you know, performance. And I think it's when you have these nuances in performance that one knows exactly where to go to be able to sort of support them, do better and do more. And so in the case of Nigeria, I think on the gas side, what is clear is that we need clarity on pricing, clarity on the contracts, and this is what the index looks at and talks about and says, you know, in this sector, in this segment, you know, you could do better and the reuse of the resources could be better the resources could be put to better use for the benefit of the people of Nigeria. So I think that this is the important nuance that we need when we talk about countries like Nigeria, because Nigeria is growing and was growing during the oil boom, and it must mean that there was some repercussion and some give back from the oil sector. The question is, when you have a crisis, was there any savings from that sector that ensures that, you know, you can continue to service the people of Nigeria in a way that is useful and important for them?
Yeah, between oil and gas and mining, solid minerals, extractive, what part of these sectors do you think is doing better on this index ranking and which one is lagging behind?
My sense is I don't think looking at the Natural Resource Governance Index and the benefit of it is that we have numbers with which we can use it. I don't think one can say the oil sector across the continent is doing well or the gas sector is not doing so well. I think what the report shows is that we have good progress in some parts of some sectors and not so good in some parts of some sectors. I think that what the report clearly shows is that in countries where we have overall stronger institutions, you have generally better management of the oil, gas, and mining sectors. And where you don't have strong enough institutions, then there are generally weaknesses. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that the report also begins to tease at is that where you have good revenue, a good fiscal base, and clarity on your sort of fiscal performance and your fiscal structures, you get, and again, I want to come back to the fact that this report looks at value maximization, revenue, and the business environment in those particular sectors. So it's very focused in that sense.